What is up, everybody? Sean Sheehan back here with another edition of the Sheehan Show on Sherdog.com. And today I want to talk to you about judging. So I've done a few judging podcasts here on Sherdog over the last year or so, and we've had some good chats. We've talked about 10-8s, and we've talked about a few other things as well when it comes to the world of judging. But we had the fight between Sean Strickland and Jack Hermansson on Saturday night, and there was a bit of controversy coming out from it. A few people asked my opinion, and I said I'd put it in a video to talk, overall about judging and how fights can be scored, like the fight we had last Saturday night, but also specifically that fight. And I'll maybe touch a little bit on the co-main event as well, Nick Maximov and Punahele Soriano. But that one, I think, is that will be a more overall discussion maybe than the actual fight itself. But let's talk about the main event here for a second. And also as well, before we start any of this, if you haven't seen the judging criteria, if you haven't read it, I have videos up on here and over on Severe MMA as well, where you can go over and you can look at that, where I talk through the criteria. But you can also, if you just Google MMA judging criteria, go to the ABC website, and it's the first one there. It's free. It's only 3.5 pages long, not that long at all whatsoever. And it's a great starting point. Now, you don't get everything by just reading it. You don't understand the whole criteria by just reading those 3.5 pages. It takes a long time to kind of understand it and see lots of different examples of fights and get your ideas straight, I suppose, in your head, and get what around looks like to be scored correctly, and not just via the criteria, but when held up against other rounds. And I think that's a very important point as well. A really smart judge told me once, if you score a fight 10-8 in a night, and there's a fight 2 hours later, and it's way more of a beating. The first one was a pretty close 10-9 to 10-8, and you give that 10-8 as well. Like, can you acknowledge that is the same? Can you acknowledge that both of those ones are scored correctly, or will you be able to hold both of those rounds up when compared to each other? And that's another big thing as well that I think, and maybe that's a discussion for a different day, but when you're talking about judging, it's not just the criteria, it's all rounds together, and consistency. And consistency is a big thing. And you know what? Before I get into no, I'll leave that to the end. I'll stick to the way I have it here in my notes and the way I was going to do it. But I have to talk about consistency towards the latter end of this discussion, because it's a big thing, and I think it's really an issue I think people get wrong and really don't understand. But we will chat about that. So let's talk about Hermansson versus Strickland. For me, it was a fight that disappointed in lots of different ways. Both guys came out afterwards and apologized for their performances. And it was one of those fights, if you were to ask, will both come out and apologize for their performance after watching it, you probably said it would. And as someone who talks about the sport an awful lot and has to discuss all these fights, I never like coming out criticizing fighters or criticizing fights or anything like that, but sometimes you have to too. If you're covering the NFL, you're covering the Premier League or something, and there's it's an NFL game that ends 7-3 or something like that, well, you're going to say it's rubbish, aren't you? And if it's a 0-0 soccer game, you're going to say it's rubbish too, aren't you? Well, you probably are. So why can't we do any different in MMA? And we didn't quite have that. It wasn't the worst fight I've ever seen or anything, but it just felt a little bit like both guys didn't fight to their utmost, or didn't kind of produce what we were hoping they would produce. And that can happen at the upper echelon, I suppose, the top 10 level of mixed martial arts. And I think that's in part what happened here, and in part as well the styles clash, I think, kind of just wasn't ideal for the actual fight itself. But the judging. So before I get into a specific round by round, and I'm not actually going to go into all the rounds specifically in terms of what happened in all of them, because I think that's actually pointless when you look at how the fights are actually scored. So I have my notes here. This is how the fight was scored. The three judges, Derek Cleary, Sal D'Amato, and Junichiro Kamijo. So Cleary gave So round one for Cleary was Strickland, and the other two judges gave it to Hermansson. Round two, all three judges gave it to Strickland. Round three, Cleary and D'Amato both gave it to Hermansson, and Junichiro Kamijo gave it to Strickland. And round four, all three judges gave it to Strickland. And round five, it was given to Jack Hermansson by Sal D'Amato. And the other two judges gave it to Sean Strickland. Now, let me just make sure that's right again. So, yeah, Kamijo gave it to Strickland. And the first judge, Derek Cleary, gave it to Strickland. So the one judge that gave the fight to Jack Hermansson was Sal D'Amato. And look, I think everyone was a little bit shocked when that was read out. It was a fight that if you watched it and didn't judge it, I think everyone kind of knew who won it. You know, everyone knew that the winner was Sean Strickland. But fighting isn't scored that way. Fighting is scored round by round, and this fight was scored round by round. And now you can say whether that's a limitation of the sport or the limitation of the system which we use, not the system itself, because I don't think it is a limitation of the system itself. Maybe that's a discussion for later or another day as well. But you can argue that. But those are the rules we have. You know, those are the rules we have. Like an NBA game, the finals goes to 7 games, right? If you win the first game 100 points to 2, and you win the next, what would it be, 3 games by 1, the other crowd wins the next 3 games by 1 point, who wins that? Well, it's the team that wins the series 3-1, even though on aggregate they have lost by 96 points or whatever it might be. And MMA works the same way. Now there can be 10-8s and stuff like that, as obviously we know. But that's generally how it works. Now, for this fight, it didn't necessarily come down to that. We could talk obviously again about those limitations, maybe of the 10-9 and why people think there are limitations, and I don't necessarily think there are. But with this fight, look, it came down, I think, to that third round more than anything else. The fifth round was given only by Sal D'Amato to Jack Hermansson, but actually the fifth round was one of those rounds where I was kind of expecting it to go to Jack Hermansson for a few different people. So look, the first round, very, very close. And I don't think there was much to argue with whether you give it the other way or whether you give it, to Hermansson or whether you give it to Strickland. I tweeted out I thought I gave it to Strickland. It came up on the broadcast, and 2 other people tweeted out, said they gave it to Hermansson. They both came up on the broadcast, and Paul Felder read it out, and he was like, "Oh, everyone's saying that they gave it to Hermansson." I was like, "Oh well, thanks, Paul." And in the second round, Strickland, all 3 judges, I think everyone gives that to him. And in the third, fourth, and fifth round, now we'll leave the third round for a second. I thought the fourth and fifth round honestly could have gone either way. And now let me back all this up by saying, first of all, I gave 2 of my bets this week for Jack Hermansson to win straight up, being one of them, and the other one to win by submission, so that's out the window. And I also scored this fight 50-45. You can look it up on MMA Decisions. I scored it 50-45 for Strickland, right? So I picked Hermansson, and I gave Strickland every single round. So if you want to talk about bias or anything, I don't think that's fair in in this actual argument itself. So the fourth and the fifth round, I thought they were both relatively close, especially the fifth. Like, the jabs all night were the thing that kind of won rounds, for me anyway, for Strickland. But in the fifth round, I think Hermansson was landing more shots. He was landing some heavy shots. Then Strickland kind of came back in the last minute, and I actually had Hermansson ahead and would have given it 49-46, but I thought the last minute or so he landed some nice shots, and especially that last kick as well. I'm not sure how big it landed or anything like that, but at the time I thought, well, there's a bit of power on that. There hasn't been much there isn't much of a difference in terms of effective striking or grappling. Maybe that's enough, so I gave it all 5 rounds to Sean Strickland. If you gave that round to Hermansson, I don't think anyone can argue. I don't think there's anyone at home listening to this that would probably disagree with that as well. Now, when I say disagree, we can agree or disagree, but we need to understand. Like, you can understand my score of Strickland, I can understand your score of Hermansson for the fifth round. Are we okay with that? The first round, I think, is the exact same. We can understand the score. We might not agree. I can absolutely understand the score of Hermansson. You can understand the score of Strickland that I gave. That's fine. So that's 2 of the rounds that could have gone either way, right? We're all agreed on that. So this is, people talking about this as a big robbery and massive and all, when a lot of people would agree that a score of 48-47 Strickland is absolutely fine, and that 2 rounds could have gone absolutely either way. Now, I would go further than that and say the 4th round could have kind of gone either way as well. Now, I scored that for Strickland as well. I thought it was a Strickland round, don't get me wrong. But I could see that for Hermansson. I could see that 4th round for Hermansson. I tweeted out last night, or on Saturday night, I thought the split before the cards came out, I thought the split would be because of 1, 4, and 5. And now it wasn't. But I think 4 could have been split, but all 3 judges, I'm just looking at my notes here again, all 3 judges gave it to Sean Strickland. And it was the 3rd round, the one that split him. And I was kind of surprised to see both Derek Cleary and Sal D'Amato gave the 3rd round to Jack Hermansson. So I went back and I watched it, with a fairly fine-tooth comb. And honestly, this 3rd round was razor thin. At the time, this 3rd round was Hermansson taking over the fight. It was his jab landing better. It was just him being able to keep the fight standing and Hermansson not being able to take the fight down, right? And everyone coming in, our thought was, you listen to my shows here, I said it, if it's on the feet, Strickland will win it. If it's on the ground, Hermansson will win it. But that's not necessarily how the fight went, or that's not necessarily how fights normally go. You could say, if Ryan Hall gets the fight to the ground against Sean O'Malley, he's going to win it. But what if Sean O'Malley gets on top and lands 10 elbows? Who's winning that? Who's winning that? And I'm not saying that happened here necessarily, but just because what we think the fight should look like, it does not necessarily mean what fight is actually happening. And sometimes our mind is like, well, look, Sean Strickland has it here. He's taken over. Now it's time for him to shoot on. But the judges are not looking at that. They're not looking at what happened before. They're not looking at the betting odds. They're not looking at who they picked. They're not looking at the tactics. They're not looking at the momentum of the fight. They're looking at the punches being thrown, the takedowns, the submission attempts, and all of that. They're looking at second by second by second by second over 5 minutes. So you have to go back and look at it that way if you want to score. Like when I was watching it live last night, I was watching it to score it. Don't get me wrong, I always do. But I was also watching it as someone who was about to do a podcast on it, who was about to talk about the ins and outs of the fight for 20 minutes on a podcast and about, how the fight went and the story of the fight and the tactics of the fight and all of that. I wasn't just watching for the exact punch landed at this exact time to put someone ahead that was a bigger or a smaller punch than someone else landed, or a better takedown attempt or a better submission attempt or whatever it might be. That's not the way I was watching it at the time, but the judges were watching it that way specifically. Now, we all watch it that way a bit, but we don't all watch it that way specifically. And when you go back and you watch it, without a shadow of a doubt, a close round. Hermansson, I went back and I watched it, and I think Strickland still won it. I think his jabs were the most effective strikes around, don't get me wrong, but there's no way you can go back and watch that round in itself without watching the first and second. If you could go back and watch it and pause this podcast, don't watch the first and second, don't watch the 4th and 5th, just watch the 3rd by itself. And it's one that's really hard. It's a hard round to score. And I think this whole fight was it was a nightmare for the judges, to be honest, because there wasn't that much output. If you think about it, right, all 5 rounds, here's something we can all agree on. There was no 10-8 in this, was there? So this went 25 minutes, 5 rounds with 15 rounds judged, 3 judges judging 5 rounds, and not one of them gave a 10-8, and I think everyone would agree with that. Whether you agree it's 10-9 one way or 10-9 another way, we would all agree there's no 10-8. So when we get to that, right, when we get to that position, we know there's no blowouts. We know there's absolutely no blowouts in it whatsoever. And I would almost suggest that every single one of those rounds could have been turned from a 10-9 to a 9-10 with one big blow, right? Imagine someone lands a head kick with 10 seconds left on any of those rounds, any of them, right? Say Hermansson's ahead in a round if you think that. Strickland lands a head kick, knocks him down, he's certainly saved by the bell. That moves to 9-10 from 10-9. Or the other way around, Strickland is ahead, well ahead, he's jabbing him up, but and then a head kick comes from Hermansson, that would go the other way to Hermansson. I would say that for every single one of those rounds. So when you come to that, and that's not wrong, that's the way MMA is scored. MMA is scored via effective grappling and striking. If a big knockdown happens, that's more effective than anything that's happened throughout the fight. Now, it can be effective in terms of game plan. It can be effective in terms of momentum, in terms of moving to fight where you want it to move, in terms of tiring out a fight or something like that. Like, clinching is really effective for fighting, but clinching doesn't score a jot. You know, if you clinch someone for 2.5 rounds, they get really tired and knock them out in the 4th round. Well, that clinching is really, really, really effective. But you might be down 30-27 on the cards by the time you get that knockout. You know what I mean? That's how judging works. And in this, there was a lot of effective striking for Sean Strickland, don't get me wrong. Lots of lovely jabs. But was there anything big and massive and like concussive that knocked Hermansson down, that hurt him, that cut him open, that reddened his face? He had a bit of his face was reddened up, mostly by the jabs, which were very good. But out of the jabs that were landed, you know, I'd say a small percentage were big, effective punches that hurt Hermansson. All of them are effective punches, don't get me wrong, and really nice punches. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a massive fan of the jab and never say anything bad about it. But when you look at that fight from a judging point of view specifically, it's a lot closer of a fight than we watched it live and that we gave it credit for. Now, the judges got it right as well. To move on maybe from the soliloquy on how the fight it went itself. The judges got it right. You know, who won the fight? Sean Strickland won the fight. You know, sometimes we go overboard. Remember that Paul Felder, Rafael Dos Anjos card? Everyone lost their shit over it. Who won that fight? Who won it? Rafael Dos Anjos won the fight. Like, everyone got mad over one card for Paul Felder. And the reason there is 3 judges is because of that. You know, if someone, let's say there is a big punch, a knockdown at the very end of a round, and it goes from a 10-9 to a 9-10, and one judge just happens to miss it. You know, there's those big fucking posts in the middle of the thing, and the judge like this, and he goes like this, and the time it takes for him to move like that, the guy gets knocked down, but he doesn't see the kick. He just sees the guy on the ground. That could have been a slip. That could have been anything. So the judge is not seeing that, and he can't score it. That's a massive limitation with judging like that, right? And that can happen, and I know judges, I've spoken to them, and they hate it. You know, it's one of those things that really, really irks judges. And I spoke to a guy about once, an incident like that happening, and he kind of got a bit mad at me once. He's like, I don't want to talk about that kind of job, which is very, very understandable. These people take it really, really seriously. And I can tell you that for a fact. To a lot of people, they're nameless, faceless people. But I've spoken to a lot of judges and referees and officials, and these people take it really, really seriously. I can tell you that for a fact. So that can happen. You know, that really can happen. And the reason we have 3 judges is to, make up for that. To make up for that inability for someone to see something or for someone to make a mistake. Let's say, you know, you're in Texas, which has judges that judge fights like once in a blue moon. And maybe you have a local judge and then two good judges. Well, that local judge won't matter because you'll have 2 good judges who get it the right way. Like that, the 3 judging thing is there to legislate for one wacky card, right? So that's why it's there. I actually think we'd be better off with 1 judge. Now, I'll talk in a second, and maybe I'll talk here about people talking about 5 judges and everything like that. I think if you had 1 judge who knows the scoring criteria perfectly and who could do it without pressure and everything like that and decide the winner of the fight, I actually think that'd be better than 3 judges. But the pressure you would put on that judge, it's just too much. It's too much. So 3 is right. You know, let's say in the 3 judges, one of them feels the pressure and something happens. That doesn't happen with the big judges and the ones who've been doing it for years. But that's another reason, you know, to have someone there. The people calling for 5 judges need to think about it, right? So why are you calling for 5 judges, right? I actually find it very hard to not understand to understand the reasoning for 5 judges. It's like, let's say we have 1 wacky judge, right? Well, the other 2 judges are going to take care of that and are going to take care of the score. Or 1 score that, not just wacky, but 1 score that's wrong because for a multitude of reasons which I just spoke about. Well, the other 2 will get it right? You have a massive problem if you have 2 wrong and you have 3 getting it right. That's a big, big issue. That is a big, big issue, right? So what you need is more good judges, or you know, not more good judges, but you need good judges and as few of them as possible so we can get it right. the problem is it's very hard to get good judges. Like, it's really hard to get good judges. And you want to put 5 on, and then you have 10 fights a night. You know, and you can't have the same 5 judges doing every fight. That's very, very hard. I know in some places they do it, but you want to rotate around those judges. So, you know, I think they usually have maybe 6 judges a night when there's 3 now. Then you'd need probably 10. That is a lot. That is a lot of judges to have a high quality, a high level of judging when you have an Eagle FC card the week before, and maybe someone can't make this card, and you have a Bellator card coming up, and maybe, you know, Ireland's coming up, and I'm sure there's UFC that weekend, so some of those judges are going to be in Ireland doing the Bellator card, and then some more are going to be in America doing whatever UFC card is on. And, you know, there's probably a PFL on as well. It's the same weekend, right? That's 30 judges you need. 30 judges, 30 high-level judges you need for those 3 cards. Is that what we're looking for here? I don't think anyone has thought that through. Like, there's a lot of things, open scoring, a thing I'll talk about in another podcast, but it's one of those things that people really, really haven't thought through or anything like that. I think it's just a ridiculous sentiment, and it makes absolutely no sense at all. So yeah, that was my thoughts on that. Another couple of things I just wanted to touch on here. There's a lot of people calling for Sal D'Amato to be fired after last night, right? Sal D'Amato gave round 1, round 3, and round 5 to Jack Hermansson, right? Round 1, another judge agreed. Round 3, another judge agreed. And round 5, I think a lot of people scored round 5 for Hermansson. Like, I don't think there's anyone. If Sal D'Amato had just scored round 5 for Hermansson, right, would anyone be giving out? Would anyone be going mad? Would anyone say, oh, what an awful card that is? If Sal D'Amato had just scored round 1 for Hermansson, would anyone be saying, oh, that's awful? No. Now, and look, it's round 3, I think, is the odd one. And I don't think that's right. I think it's wrong, but it was a close round without a shadow of a doubt. But based on one round, that was very close. Someone should be fired. Someone should be fired. You know, we had 2 rounds that were very close, and absolutely, I think they could have gone either way. One round, I still think it kind of could have gone on either way, but I think it's clear but close, I would say, to Strickland. You want someone to get fired over that and never judge again? I think people are just kind of losing it a little bit and get really, really mad. A massive problem, and this is a big thing. If you take anything from this podcast, take what I'm about to say right now. Close rounds can lead to close fights, right? Imagine this. The first round of Hermansson versus Strickland that we saw on Saturday night, everyone would agree that was very close, right? There was the leg kicks from Hermansson, the jabs from Strickland. I would say most people gave it to Hermansson. I gave it to Strickland, right? Let's say that round, it's a 3-round fight, right? Let's say it's a 3-round fight, right? Let's say that exact round happens in the second round. Let's say that exact round happens again in the third round. Then what do? I would have that fight 30-27 for Strickland, because I believe he won it the first time. If the exact same thing happened again, I would believe he won it the second time. If the exact same thing happened again, I would believe he won it the third time. You out there, if you picked Hermansson to win the first round, then you believe Hermansson won the first, Hermansson won the second, Hermansson won the third. You'd have that fight 30-27. I'd have that fight 27-30. We'd have it the exact opposite way. And that can happen between 2 judges as well. You know? That can happen. And it can happen for 3 rounds in a 5-round fight. It could happen for 5 rounds in a 5-round fight. Imagine if we had that. We had a 50-45 and a 45-50. Imagine if we had that. That's possible. That is possible. And everyone would lose it. People would be absolutely up in arms. But that can happen. It can happen. And people might say, okay, that's a limitation of the criteria or limitation of the judging system. You find me a criteria or a judging system that can alleviate close rounds, and you will be a rich person, I'm telling you. Now, you could say, okay, we have to fight to a finish. And absolutely, that'd finish it. That'd be absolutely right. But that's not logical. That's not going to happen. That's not a thing that can happen. There is no scoring system. There is nothing you can do to stop close rounds. That first 5 minutes of Strickland versus Hermansson is a close round under any criteria in anyone's book. It's a really, really close round, and you can't stop it from being a close round in any way. You just can't stop it from being a close round. Now, people might say that might lead to inconsistency, and that's the last thing I'll touch on here, because and I talked about it earlier on, but people said that will lead to inconsistency, right? And it absolutely will. But there are two things you can have, right? You can have an understanding, right? An understanding or something you do not understand, right? And if you can consistently understand the score, then judging is good. If you consistently can't understand the score that the judge gives, then it's bad, right? I would say that was fair. You can't agree on everything. We will never, ever, ever in a million years, under any criteria, any scoring system, have consistent agreement on rounds. Never. We didn't have it for Hermansson and Strickland round 1. We did not have it. We didn't have it for Maximov versus Punahele Soriano. I'm a big one for talking about effective striking, effective grappling. There was very little effective striking, effective grappling from either guy in that. And I scored the fight for Maximov because I thought he had like a little bit more. And Soriano did very, very little. Very little. They both did very little. Like, what are you supposed to do? You have to choose someone. Like, and the thing about this is, right, and we leave that fight aside for a second and talk about consistency again, because I really want to talk about that, right? If you're paying attention to all these fights, all these rounds for a long, long time, like I've done, like I break down every round. Listen to the boys over in Couch. What's the name of the podcast? Couchside with Scott Fontana and Dan Urban. I always mess up the name. Couchside Seats, I think it is. They do a great job every Monday or Tuesday breaking down every round, and I do it on here and I do it on the Severe MMA podcast, and I talk about it. And I've been doing it for years, right? And as well, at the end of the year, I do this thing where we have robbery of the year, and I have to get nominations. There are very, 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 very few robberies in MMA these days. Since the criteria has been changed, since we have the new criteria, robberies are almost gone from MMA. Do we have some wacky rounds? Do we have some rounds I would disagree with and can't understand? Absolutely. The Felder Dos Anjos one, absolutely. Who won that fight? This one, do you disagree with round 3? Do I disagree with round 3? Absolutely. Do I think Strickland won? Absolutely. Who won? Who won the fight? Sean Strickland won the fight. So we have safeguards, we have 3 judges, we have a criteria that people understand, we have a criteria that the judges put into place. Whether you disagree or not, you can understand it. So we have now a few years, and a good few years, of these extremely consistent scores coming in and these extremely consistent results. And that's the most important thing. More important than the score is the result. Can you pick out a robbery? Can you? Let's do this, right? Anyone is out there, and I'll end it on this. Go back over the last 5 years in MMA, right? How many fights has there been in the last 5 years in MMA? Untold amount. Even just do it in the UFC, right? And give me 5 nominations from each year for robbery of the year. That's only 25 fights, right? Out of 2,000, whatever it might be. Give me 25. And if you can do that, I'll admit that judging is bad. And I'll admit that judging is inconsistent. But you can't. I do it every year. I've done it every year for the last 5 years. And I find it really, really hard to get 2. Like the one from last year, Rory McDonald against Gleason Tebow. Very bad decision. Didn't understand it. Thought it was very bad. Very, very bad. I went back and I watched it. And look, it wasn't the worst decision I've ever seen. But it was a bad decision, I thought. There was very, very few other ones. Very few. Very few. Judging has become more consistent now than it ever has been. And we can talk more about other things in the future. Like a lot of people talk about how judges are held to account, what they do to learn, and all things like that. And we can talk about that again in the future. And I can assure you they do all of those things. But for now, if you look at the facts and you go through it like I've done week in, week out, you can listen to my podcast for the last 5 years. Tell me anyone else who's gone through it and told you about the bad decisions that have been consistently bad with the knowledge and done it the correct way to show you why they're actually bad for the last 5 years. Show me anyone that's done that. And you won't be able to, because no one has done it, because it doesn't exist, because it's not true. The people who say judging is inconsistent, the people who say it's bad, the people who say there's terrible decisions there all the time, are just saying it because it's their opinion. They're not saying it based on facts. And I leave it there. My name is Sean Sheehan for Sherdog.com. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, let me know. Give me a tweet. Put a comment down below. click the like button, click subscribe. We're also on Spotify now as well. If you look for Sherdog Podcast, Sherdog Radio Network, you can subscribe there and listen in as well. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all next time.